In our time, right across the planet, the past is receding from us at an ever faster rate. And that's especially so here in China. But the traveller searching for the meaning of China's ancient culture can still find it in China's present. For here, running under the surface, are deep currents still shared by all Chinese people. And among them is one great stream that has sustained the Chinese across the ages, their poetry.
China has the oldest living tradition of poetry in the world, more than 3,000 years old, older than Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And for the Chinese, poets have always been the ones who most truthfully express the feelings of the people. And to the Chinese, their greatest poet is Du Fu. Du Fu lived in the 8th century, the age of Beowulf in Britain. It was the Tang dynasty, a time of extraordinary cultural accomplishment that ended in horrendous warfare and the death of millions. And out of that suffering, Du Fu created his art.
Du Fu belongs to a very special category. We have Dante, Shakespeare, and Du Fu. These poets create the very values by which poetry is judged.
In the East, he's one of the immortals. In the West, few people have even heard of him. This is a journey in the footsteps of China's greatest poet. Du Fu was born into China's greatest epoch, the Tang dynasty. At the time of his birth, the Tang had ruled for a century from their capital, Shangan, today's Xi'an. It was the greatest city on earth, with more than 1 million people. Rich, powerful, and open to the world, for the Chinese, that time was their golden age. The catalyst for it all was the Silk Road, along which people, goods and ideas flowed from India, Iran and Central Asia into the crowded streets of the capital. The Tang was a cosmopolitan empire of many cultures and languages. In its markets you could find a dazzling mix of foreign fashions and food, Persian pistachios and the golden peaches of Samarkand.
Very, very good.
And Du Fu's extraordinary life story would be entwined forever with the tale of this city and the fate of Tang China itself. Only a year after Du Fu was born, a new emperor came to the dragon throne, Xuanzong, who was nicknamed the Brilliant. The emperor would oversee China's most glorious period of culture, and above all, its greatest age of poetry. And for the Chinese people, it's poetry which gives the truest history of the human heart.
中国的中华民族是一个比较注意历史记载的民族。那么杜甫的诗歌呢，是诗歌当中结合历史结合的最好的作品。同时，这个记录还把他个人生活史和个人的精神史也记录在了诗篇当中。
The Du family were an old upper-middle-class clan of officials and poets. In imperial China, the two went together. You couldn't be a Mandarin without proving your literary skills. The family house is long gone. This is all that's left. but tradition says that he was born here in this room. His mother died when he was an infant, and he was brought up by his aunt, whom he adored. And that brings us to a first mysterious story.
When he was a baby, this region was struck by plague and people were dying everywhere. And one day, a sorceress, a shamaness, came to the house and looked in the bedroom. And two babies were asleep in the room, the son of the aunt and little Dufu. And the sorceress prophesied that only one of these children would survive. And the child had to be sleeping in the southeast corner of the room. And the aunt took her child out of that corner and put Dufu there. And for that reason, says Dufu, my aunt's son died, and I lived.
So maybe, even as a child, he felt as if he had the mark of destiny on him. More than 1,400 of his poems survive, a uniquely intimate autobiography. Years later, as an old man, he wrote the story of his childhood and youth in a poem spoken by Ian McKellen.
When I was still only in my 7th year, my mind was already full of heroic deeds. My first poem was about the phoenix, the harbinger of a sagacious reign, a new age of wisdom. When I was in my 9th year, I'd already written enough poems to fill a satchel. At 14, I first began to read my poems in public. The literary masters compared me to the great writers of the past. I was temperamental, and I was already overfond of wine. I needed it to soften an uncompromising hatred of wickedness and hypocrisy. I associated only with wise old greyheads. Exhilarated by wine, we cast our glances over the entire universe, and all vulgar worldliness dwindled into oblivion.
I find that portrait of the artist as a young man, written by the older Dufu, really authentic. He obviously felt, even by the age of 14, that he was different from his schoolmates and his contemporaries. Maybe also already looking at the world as it ought to be, rather than as it actually is.
And as for his early inspirations, over 50 years later, he tells a story from his childhood. How, as a 5-year-old boy, he was taken to see a great dancer and was overwhelmed by her magic.
I remember when I was still a child, aged 5, I saw the famous dancer Kung Sun perform the sword dance. Watching her, you felt heaven struggling against the earth. When she bent back, you saw 9 suns falling, shot down by Yi, the god of archers. When she leapt, you imagined gods astride flying dragons in the clouds. When she advanced, you expected thunder and lightning from a gathering storm. And when she stopped, you saw the soft light over a vast, calm sea.
For Dufu, it was an unforgettable image of creative freedom and passion, in which the dance became a metaphor for all art, whether calligraphy, painting, or poetry. In his late teens, the family were rich enough to allow him to go travelling. China then was at the height of its glory under the brilliant emperor. Those days, Dufu wrote, rice was succulent the granaries were full, and not a robber on the road in all the 9 provinces of China. No other civilization in the world was so refined or so cultured. Travelling across the empire, Du Fu gathered stories, visiting the legendary sites of heroes and dragons, immersing himself in China's ancient traditions. Like any tourist today, he admired the famous monuments. The great Buddhas of Long Men, he wrote, in their giant gorge cutting through the countryside, where every vista reveals gold and silver Buddha temples. But for Du Fu, there was one special place of pilgrimage, Chufu, the birthplace of the philosopher Confucius. Born over 1,000 years before Du Fu's day, Confucius had shaped the core values of Chinese civilization. For him, the main goal of life is social harmony and stability under a virtuous ruler. And each person has a role to play in helping the emperor achieve that common good.
Teachings of Confucius were Du Fu's guiding principles all his life: virtue, benevolence, service to the state. In a sense, you could say that, like much of the Chinese political tradition from ancient times, even to today, his thought was utopian.
So he went to the capital, Chang'an, today's Xi'an, expecting to become a government official. It was his chance to serve the brilliant emperor and help continue the new age of wisdom.
Chang'an, the city of peace. Along with Constantinople and Baghdad, it was a world city in the 8th century, the symbol of all that human civilization had to offer. And this place had a powerful presence in Du Fu's imagination all his life. It was the dream of success and power and fame, which one day he hoped he would achieve. And in his early 20s, he came here to sit the imperial examinations, confident that a glittering career lay ahead of him.
In the prime of life, I was sent by my home prefecture to sit the state examinations. I feared no rival among the competing scholars, nor any difficult questions that might be put to me. I thought, of course, that I was extraordinary and should immediately climb to the top and restore the purity of culture and civilization. But unfortunately, the Board of Examinations thought otherwise. They failed me. All my hopes were shattered.
Why does he fail, do you think?
Yeah, most important question. Many scholars discussing about this. 我想关键的原因是比较有说服力的说法，是红叶提出来的。红叶认为杜甫可能涉及到他参加科举考试那一年的这个科举考试的一个风波当中。那么这次风波影响到那一年参加考试的很多考生。杜甫不幸被卷进去了。这个恐怕和他参加考试的个人才能关系不是很大。This is the first explanation.
Yeah.
There are a second one.
Right.
第二个是比较通常的解释，就是杜甫他写诗的才能和参加科举考试写文章的才能是不匹配的。那么他主要才能在于写诗。
Too much of a poet and not enough of a bureaucrat, that would be his problem. The examinations were the path to wealth and status, and exam failure cut him loose from the career ladder. So for a while he wandered, picking up jobs where he could, and hating himself for living on the coattails of the rich.
The next few years, I played and roamed. In the spring, I sang on the terraces where the poets competed. Summer, I hunted among the green hills. In the winter, I whistled for the falcons in the purple oak forests, chased wild beasts on cloud and snow ridge. I trailed my hems wherever sweet ale was served and drank myself sick.
Then, when he was about 30, came the meeting that changed his life with the poet Li Bai.
Li Bai was the great poet of the time. Du Fu calls him the star of the Golden Gate. Charismatic, drunkard, brawler, frequenter of the blue houses, as the Chinese call them. He killed men in fights. But he was a brilliant, innovative, scintillating poet. And Du Fu fell under his spell. What wonderful verses he writes, said Du Fu. I love him like a brother. Those nights we travelled, we slept under the same quilt, and every day we walked together, hand in hand. We didn't think about jobs in the government. We only thought of otherworldly things.
Li Bai was Du Fu's most important creative relationship.
那李白在杜甫的心目中应该是一位师长，这个不光有年龄上的问题，还因为呢，李白在诗歌艺术上对杜甫有启发。这样的启发呢，我们今天能找到证据，非常明显的表现在对于叙事艺术细节的刻画上。
For a time, the friendship was close, at least from Du Fu's side. But then they split up, and he never saw Li Bai again, although he still dreamed of him.
Separation by death, in the end, you get over. Separation in life is a continuing grief. No word from you, old friend, but you've been in my dreams, as if you know how much I miss you. I feel as if you are no longer mortal. The distance between us is so great. The waters are deep, the waves are wide. Don't let the river gods take you.
It was an eerie premonition, for Li Bai would drown on a drunken boating trip, but he showed Du Fu what poetry could be.
It's amazing, isn't it? China's two greatest poets lived at the same time and knew each other. What effect did that relationship have on Du Fu, do you think?
Li Bo or Li Bai, Li Bo was the old pronunciation, had a character that was very charismatic. And a lot of people were attracted to him. And Du Fu worshipped him. But his poetry is not at all like that of Li Bai's.
There's almost Dionysian versus Apollonian, aren't they?
Exactly.
We'd say in Greek. Tell us about the difference.
Li Bo was very keen on ability to be at one with nature. And Du Fu was much more concerned with people and to people, and how you must live according to Confucianism. And particularly, you had to be loyal to your emperor, or to the leader you chose, at any rate. The leadership was very important to Confucianism.
And very important to Du Fu. Still hoping to serve the empire, he settled in the capital. He failed the exams again, but he kept writing. And through a friend, he sent some of his work directly to the emperor, here at the Daming Palace.
And to his astonishment, the emperor read them and summoned him. The Son of Heaven summoned me to his presence, he says. and the officials came in their carriages and their state robes. And I was amazed. In a single day, my reputation had become brilliant.
So at last, he had a job at court. His meagre stipend enabled him to marry and start a family. But the job was a dead end, and he soon became disillusioned. "I've no role at all in court discussions," he wrote, "just one of thousands who attended every whim of the Son of Heaven."
Du Fu did try to get into the civil service, but he never actually quite fitted in. And you can understand why. He was too honest a character. He wouldn't bow to whatever he had to. And however much he wanted to be a very important person who could influence the emperor, in fact, he was completely helpless.
The brilliant emperor was in his 60s now. Once a model of enlightened rule, he'd become negligent, infatuated with his concubine Yang, rewarding her family and promoting corrupt ministers. For Du Fu, the closer he got to the throne, the clearer he saw the reality of power.
It was a time when the powerful indulged in murder and plunder. The military used up the tax grain in the stores. The imperial fighting cocks had to be fed. Many warnings could have been obtained from history about why a dynasty falls.
Through all of Chinese history, the problem has been the same. The country is so big that if its rulers lose their grip, things fall apart. And it was at this point that Du Fu had a disturbing experience. What almost sounds like a sudden seizure.
Du Fu came with 3 friends here to the Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an. They went inside and climbed up to the top to take the view at sunset. But when he looked out, Du Fu was seized by a kind of existential panic. The mountains at the north began to dissolve. The Wei River disappeared. And then the imperial city itself vanished in a kind of haze. And the wild geese flew away.
The empire now went into crisis. Frontier wars had led to higher taxes. Mass conscription hit the poor. With social unrest growing, the nation was paralyzed by rains and floods, with half the capital under water. As food ran out in the city, Du Fu sent his family into the countryside, here to the village of Fengxian. But the rains were relentless. Then the harvest failed, and famine followed. Du Fu's Confucian dream was unraveling. In winter 755, desperate to make sure his family was safe, he got leave and set off to join them in Fengxian.
I set out a lone traveller at midnight, fingers too cold to tie my broken belts. At dawn, I passed the imperial palace. Here at the hot springs, the emperor entertains his court, and music echoes around the hills. Only the rich and powerful may bathe here, but the silk they wear was woven by poor people, women whose husbands are beaten for their taxes. The halls are full of ladies as fair as goddesses. The scent of perfume moves with each captivating figure, clothed in the warm furs of sable. Entertained with the finest music, fed with camel hump soup and oranges ripened in the frost. Behind the red lacquered gates, wine is left to sour, meat to rot. Outside the gates lie the bones of the frozen and the starved.
But when Du Fu got to the village, his worst fears had come true.
When I reached home, I heard wailing in the house. My infant child had died of hunger. I am ashamed of being a father, so poor that I caused my son to die for lack of food. And I am one of the privileged. If my life is so bitter, then how much worse is the life of the common people?
Worse was to come. In mid-December 755, a huge rebellion broke out, led by the renegade general An Lushan. With an army of 250,000 men, he marched on the capital.
755 is the date I always tell everybody, when the whole of China collapsed. I think the rebellion floored the empire completely. The emperor resigned and his son took over, and there was a lot of infighting. The country was completely let go of, and there was a huge drive recruitment of soldiers on either side. And it was very hard for ordinary people to live and to survive.
The crisis lasted 8 years. The destruction and loss of life was huge. Tang government censuses suggest as many as 30 million people were displaced, killed in war, or died of famine. It was as deadly as the First World War. And from this time, Du Fu's poetry conjures images from later Chinese history, when order breaks down and chaos rises like a storm. As the rebels closed in on the capital, Du Fu and his family took to the road, heading north to escape the fighting.
I remember when we first fled the rebels, hurrying north over dangerous trails, the whole family trudging endlessly, begging without shame from the people we met. We walked for 10 days, holding hands, half in rain and thunder. Through the mud we pulled each other on, searching the horizon for a wisp of smoke that might lead us to a safe shelter.
The war was the turning point in Du Fu's life and the great divide in his poetry.